I found out my wife's secret during our perfect vacation. David sat at his desk, a cup of cold coffee in front of him, his eyes wandering to the window where the sun was just beginning to set. The world outside seemed to move at its own pace, while he sat frozen in his thoughts. Life with Olivia had always appeared perfect to the outside world. They had been the couple everyone admired, successful, happy, with two beautiful children. Their life, it seemed, was flawless, just as Olivia had always promised. He remembered their first meeting, how Olivia had captivated him with her charm, her laughter that lit up any room. He was the grounded, practical businessman, steady, reliable, loyal. She was the socialite who commanded attention wherever she went. They had seemed an ideal match. Their children, Lily and Ethan, were away on holiday with David's parents, and for the first time in years, David and Olivia had a rare moment of solitude. It was supposed to be a time to reconnect, to find their way back to each other. But as he sat in his study, staring out the window, he couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Olivia had suggested a vacation, just the two of them, to escape the pressures of their daily lives. It sounded like a good idea, and David trusted her judgment. After all, she always knew what was best. But as the departure date grew closer, he began to notice subtle changes in Olivia. Her excitement about the trip seemed rehearsed, and there was an edge to her voice that made David pause. "I'll handle everything," she had told him, her voice light and carefree, as though it were a favor to him. David didn't argue. It was easier not to, and part of him was relieved that he wouldn't have to deal with the details. But as the days leading up to the vacation passed, a nagging feeling began to take root in David's chest. He wasn't sure what it was, just a sense that something was off. His mind told him to trust Olivia, but something in his gut told him otherwise. The morning of their departure arrived too soon. David had hardly slept, his mind racing with thoughts that he couldn't quite articulate. He had gone through the motions, packing, double-checking the itinerary, but everything felt distant, like he was just a spectator in his own life. Olivia was already in the kitchen, preparing breakfast when he entered. She smiled brightly at him, but it was the kind of smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. She was already on her phone, typing away as she multitasked with ease. "I've got the car service coming to pick us up at 10, she said, not looking up from her screen. "It's all set." David nodded, still half asleep. He had expected her to be more engaged, to maybe ask if he needed anything, but Olivia seemed perfectly content in her own little world. "Great," he said, though he wasn't sure what exactly was great about it. He went to the living room, sitting on the couch, trying to push away the unease that had settled deep in his chest. When the car arrived, Olivia was already in the backseat, her makeup flawless, her appearance pristine. David, still in his jeans and casual shirt, tossed his bag into the trunk and slid into the seat beside her. "Did you check if the hotel is ready for us?" he asked, trying to make conversation. "Of course," she replied, her eyes fixed on her phone. "Everything's fine. You just relax, okay? You deserve a break." David wasn't sure if he had ever truly relaxed around Olivia. There was always something in the back of his mind, always a sense that he was just a supporting character in her world, never the lead. But he kept his thoughts to himself, not wanting to start a conversation that might escalate into something uncomfortable. The drive to the airport was uneventful, though David noticed how distracted Olivia seemed. She kept answering texts, checking emails, and speaking briefly to the driver as if they were already on a business trip rather than a vacation. It was becoming clearer to him that this was not going to be the peaceful getaway he had imagined. At the airport, Olivia was quick to check them in, almost as if she had done it 100 times before. David followed her, carrying their bags, but her focus was entirely on her phone. She barely even acknowledged the security procedures, moving like a woman who had done this dance countless times. "We're in first class, by the way," Olivia said, glancing up at him with a smile that felt rehearsed. "It's going to be amazing." David nodded absently, not really caring. First class didn't matter to him. It was just another compartment on the plane, another way to separate the wealthy from the rest of the world. It'd never been one for luxury's sake. But Olivia thrived on it. As they boarded the plane, she immediately settled into her seat and ordered a drink, and David couldn't help but notice how much she seemed at ease. He, on the other hand, was trying to adjust his seat, fumbling with the tray table, and scanning the in-flight magazine to pass the time. Throughout the flight, Olivia remained aloof, glued to her phone and checking in with her friends. There was a moment, however, when David caught her sending a message to someone he didn't recognize. She smiled at the text and quickly tucked her phone into her bag. But David had seen enough to know that there was something happening that he wasn't a part of. "Who was that?" he asked casually, his voice low. Olivia glanced at him, her eyes flashing with a look he couldn't quite interpret. "Just a friend," she replied, her tone clipped. David's stomach turned. He didn't like the feeling of being shut out, of not being included in the life that was supposed to be theirs. But he kept quiet, too aware that questioning her would only bring more tension between them. He leaned back in his seat and tried to close his eyes, but sleep wouldn't come. The resort was exactly as Olivia had described it, grandiose, elegant, and for David, a little too much. The moment they arrived, the air smelled of expensive perfume, and the staff greeted them with an over-the-top warmth that only reminded David how out of place he felt. It was a place for people who lived a different kind of life, a life of luxury and excess. Olivia immediately took charge, directing the bellhop to take their luggage while she stepped to the front desk to handle the check-in. David stood to the side, unsure of what he was supposed to be doing. He had never been good at being the center of attention in places like this, but Olivia thrived in environments where the world catered to her every whim. "Everything's ready for us," Olivia said, glancing over her shoulder with a smile. "They've upgraded us to the penthouse suite." David smiled faintly, but it felt hollow. "Nice," he replied, though he wasn't sure what the upgrade meant. He just wanted to get to the room, settle in, and maybe find a quiet spot where he could think. But as they made their way through the opulent lobby, David began to notice something strange. A group of women was standing at the bar, laughing and talking with exaggerated gestures, all dressed in stunning outfits. Olivia, with a quick wave, made her way toward them, and David followed hesitantly behind her. "These are my friends," Olivia said, introducing each one with a smile. "Clara, Fiona, and Melissa. You've heard me talk about them, right?" David nodded, though he hadn't heard much about them at all. It didn't seem to matter, though, as Olivia was already deep in conversation with Clara, her voice rising in excitement as she discussed their plans for the next few days. David was left standing at the edge of the group, trying to find a way to fit in. Clara, Fiona, and Melissa exchanged polite smiles, but their attention was clearly elsewhere, and David couldn't help but feel like an outsider in his own marriage. "So, when's the last time you and Olivia took a vacation, David?" Fiona asked, her tone light but carrying a trace of curiosity. David hesitated. "A while," he replied, though that was an understatement. He couldn't remember the last time they'd spent time together without it feeling like a performance. He looked at Olivia, hoping for some sign of solidarity, but she was too caught up in her conversation with Clara to notice. It became clear that this vacation wasn't just about the two of them. It was about Olivia and her friends. David was just along for the ride, the background player in a world he didn't belong to. The first night at the resort was a blur for David. He tried to focus on the grand dinner Olivia had arranged, but everything felt so foreign. The laughter of Olivia's friends echoed in his mind like a distant memory, and the extravagant food seemed more like a show than a meal. The chandelier above them shimmered in the soft light, casting shadows over their table. The waitstaff glided around, offering wine and refills like silent, efficient ghosts. Olivia was in her element, of course. She fit in so effortlessly with the other guests, each conversation a graceful dance of wit and charm. She was radiant, laughing, talking, and commanding attention as if she were born for this life. David, on the other hand, barely spoke. He found himself caught in the undertow of Olivia's world, drowning in the distance between them that seemed to widen with every passing minute. He caught her glancing at her phone more than once during dinner, her eyes lighting up as she typed messages, but he didn't ask. He didn't want to know. "David, you're being so quiet tonight," Clara remarked, noticing the tension that hung around him. "Come on, loosen up. It's a vacation. Why don't you join us for a nightcap?" David forced a smile. "I'm just tired. Long flight, you know." But it wasn't just the flight. It was everything. The sense of disconnection that had taken root long before they arrived at the resort. Olivia, once so attentive and affectionate, had become a stranger in front of him, absorbed in conversations with people who barely acknowledged him. He had always known Olivia was an extrovert, the kind of person who thrived on social interaction, but it never felt like it reached the point where he felt invisible. Until now. After dinner, Olivia excused herself to meet her friends in the lounge. "I'll be back in a bit. You can stay here if you want, she said, barely meeting his eyes. David nodded but stayed behind, watching the soft movements of the waiters clearing the table, the low hum of voices in the background. The night stretched on, each minute feeling like an hour. He could have followed Olivia, could have tried to be part of her world, but he knew it wasn't the same. The evening's conversations had made him painfully aware of how much she had changed, and how much he hadn't. Her world had expanded into this dazzling array of people and experiences, and he felt like he was standing on the edge, unable to cross into it. The lounge was full of music, laughter, and the clinking of glasses. David, though, found the noise unsettling. He excused himself and walked outside into the cool, quiet night. David wandered along the resort's path, the soft sound of the ocean waves crashing against the shore soothing his thoughts. The stars were bright above him, scattered across the sky like pinpricks of light. The air smelled salty, fresh, and liberating. Here, on this deserted stretch of beach, he felt a little less isolated. But it wasn't enough to silence the questions in his mind. Was this trip meant to fix something? Was it supposed to bring them closer together? He had hoped so. But now, standing in the dark, he realized that the distance between him and Olivia was growing, not shrinking. The glow from the resort's lights behind him illuminated the path in front of him. He didn't want to think about the reality of his situation. Instead, he let the waves lap against his feet, listening to their rhythmic sound as if it could clear his thoughts. A movement caught his attention. It was Olivia, standing near the water's edge, looking out at the horizon. Her silhouette was framed by the light behind her, casting her face in shadows. David hesitated for a moment, unsure whether to approach, but something about the scene, her solitude, pulled him forward. She didn't notice him at first. Her focus was entirely on the night, on the waves, on something far beyond the beach. David stopped a few feet away, unsure what to say. "You didn't follow me," Olivia's voice cut through the silence. It wasn't a question, but an observation. "I thought you needed some space," he replied quietly. Olivia turned to face him, her expression unreadable. "Why are you always so distant?" she asked, her words sharp, but tinged with something David couldn't quite place. David wasn't sure how to answer. He had always tried to be patient, to give her space, but now he wondered if that patience had been mistaken for indifference. He didn't know how to explain that he felt like he was fading away in her presence. "I don't know," he said finally, his voice small. "I just don't feel like I belong here. I'm not part of your world." Olivia's gaze softened for a moment, and she took a few steps toward him, standing close enough for him to feel the heat of her presence. "You think I don't want you here? That I don't want you with me?" David looked into her eyes, seeing the flicker of something that might have been vulnerability. But it was quickly masked by something else, perhaps frustration or even exhaustion. "I don't know what you want, Olivia," he admitted, his words feeling heavy. "I don't know who you are anymore." There was a long pause between them, the silence stretching out like the ocean before them. Olivia looked away, her gaze once again fixed on the horizon. "Maybe I don't know either," she said softly. "Maybe we've both been pretending for too long." David's heart sank, the weight of her words sinking deep into his chest. He wanted to reach out, to close the distance between them, but something inside him held back. As they stood there, the night around them quiet except for the sound of the ocean, David realized the truth that he had been avoiding for so long. He had no idea who Olivia had become, but more frighteningly, he didn't know if he could ever find his way back to her. The next morning, the air felt heavier, as if the unspoken words between them from the night before had settled like an oppressive fog. Olivia had barely said a word to David over breakfast, her attention diverted by her phone, constantly buzzing with notifications. He could feel her avoiding him, and though he tried to convince himself it didn't bother him, it did. The silence between them wasn't just uncomfortable, it was suffocating. David sat across from her at the breakfast table, his coffee cooling in front of him. He glanced out the window at the view of the turquoise ocean, but even its beauty couldn't distract him. The sun was high, and the world outside seemed so full of life, while he felt like he was sinking deeper into the shadows. Olivia finally looked up from her phone and met his gaze. Her expression was hard to read, but David could see the faint trace of frustration in her eyes. "David, we need to talk," she said quietly, her voice low but firm. His stomach twisted. He knew what was coming. The words that had been hanging between them, unspoken, would finally come to the surface, and he wasn't sure if he was ready to hear them. "Okay," he said, his voice more calm than he felt. "What's on your mind?" Olivia took a deep breath, setting her phone down on the table. "I don't know how to say this without making things worse," she began, "but I've been feeling suffocated. I thought coming here would help, that we could reconnect, but it's only made things worse." David's chest tightened. He nodded slowly, trying to process the weight of her words. It wasn't a complete shock, but hearing her say it out loud made it real. "Olivia," he said carefully, "I never meant to suffocate you. I don't know how to handle all this." He gestured vaguely, trying to encompass the growing distance, the tension in the air. "I don't know who you are anymore." She looked down at her coffee, as if considering his words. "That's just it, David. I don't think I know who I am anymore either. Maybe I've changed too much for you to even recognize me." David felt a sting in his chest at her words, but he didn't show it. He wanted to reach across the table, take her hand, tell her that things could be fixed, that they could find their way back to each other. But something in the way she said it made him feel like it was too late. She looked at him again, her gaze unwavering. "I think we've both been trying to hold on to something that's already slipping away. I've changed, and I think you have too. We're not the same people we were when we first met." David swallowed, the truth of her words settling deep inside him. "I never wanted this," he said softly, his voice breaking. "I never wanted to lose you." "You haven't lost me," Olivia replied, her tone gentle now. "But maybe we need to figure out if we still want the same things. Maybe we need some space to figure that out." Her words cut through him, sharp and painful. He couldn't deny that there was truth in what she said. He had been clinging to the past, hoping that the version of their relationship that had once worked would still fit into the present. But people change, and relationships change with them. Maybe they were too different now to fit together the way they once had. Olivia stood up, her chair scraping against the floor. She reached for her bag, slinging it over her shoulder. "I'm going for a walk along the beach. I need some time to think." David nodded silently, watching her leave the table. She didn't look back. David spent the rest of the morning walking aimlessly around the resort, trying to clear his mind. The entire place felt alien to him now, the cheerful chatter of the other guests grating on his nerves. He had hoped this trip would bring clarity, but all it had done was bring up more questions, more uncertainty. He found himself standing at the edge of the resort's infinity pool, staring out over the vast expanse of the ocean. The sun was high in the sky, casting a bright sheen over the water's surface. David's mind was a blur, swirling with thoughts of Olivia, of the past, and of the future. What did he want? What did he need? And most importantly, what did Olivia want? It had always been easy to pretend that everything was fine, that their relationship was fine, but now the cracks were impossible to ignore. Olivia had always been the one who brought light into his life, but now it felt like that light was fading, slipping away like the tide pulling back from the shore. His phone buzzed in his pocket, interrupting his thoughts. He pulled it out, hoping it was Olivia, but it was a message from his mother. "David, are you okay? I haven't heard from you in a while. Call me when you get a chance." He stared at the screen, unsure how to respond. He didn't have the energy to explain everything to her. Not right now. Instead, he typed back a quick, non-committal reply. "I'm fine, just a lot on my mind. I'll call later." He put the phone away and sat down on a lounge chair, rubbing his face with his hands. He wasn't fine. He hadn't been fine for a long time, and pretending otherwise only made everything feel worse. As the afternoon wore on, David retreated to their room, where he found Olivia sitting on the balcony, staring out at the ocean. She looked lost in thought, distant. For a moment, David hesitated, unsure whether to disturb her, but something inside him urged him forward. He stepped out onto the balcony, leaning against the railing beside her. The wind tugged at his hair, and the salty air filled his lungs. "I don't know what to do anymore," he said quietly, his voice almost a whisper. "I don't want to lose you, Olivia." Olivia didn't respond immediately. She just sat there, looking out at the horizon, the faintest frown on her face. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, she spoke. "Maybe the hardest thing we can do is let go, even when we still care about each other. But sometimes, it's the only thing left." David closed his eyes, feeling the weight of her words settle over him like a heavy blanket. He wanted to argue, to tell her that they could fix everything, that they could make it work, but he knew deep down that she was right. They were at the edge of something that neither of them knew how to cross. "I think we need some time apart," Olivia continued, her voice barely above a whisper. Not forever, but enough to figure out who we are, who we've become. I need to find myself again, David, and I need you to do the same. David swallowed hard, the lump in his throat making it difficult to speak. But he nodded, unable to find the words to disagree. The silence between them stretched out once more, the sound of the waves crashing in the distance filling the space where words once were. The following days passed in a strange, heavy quiet. Olivia kept to herself, often spending long hours walking along the beach, while David retreated into the quiet corners of the resort. The air between them seemed to pulse with unspoken thoughts, with emotions too raw to be voiced. It was as if they were both searching for something, though neither was sure what it was. David found himself spending a lot of time in the resort's small library, staring out of the windows at the waves crashing against the rocks. The books around him felt like distant company, old stories and forgotten tales, untouched by time. He picked up a novel from the shelf, but didn't read a single word. His mind was consumed by Olivia, by the space between them that only seemed to grow with each passing day. In the evenings they would sit together at dinner, but it was a hollow ritual, a performance they both played their parts in. The words they spoke were meaningless, polite gestures that didn't reach beyond the surface. There was no warmth in the way they shared their meals, no intimacy in the way they spoke. It was as if they had forgotten how to truly be with each other. David couldn't ignore the gnawing feeling that something inside of him was dying. He couldn't tell if it was his relationship with Olivia, his sense of self, or something deeper, something that had been quietly festering in him for a long time. All he knew was that he was lost, adrift in a sea of confusion. He had always been good at pretending that everything was fine, pretending that he was in control. But the mask was slipping, and beneath it, there was only emptiness. One afternoon, when the sky had turned a deep shade of indigo and the last traces of sunlight were fading into the horizon, David took a walk through the resort's lush gardens. He had wandered here before, but tonight it felt different, more significant somehow. The scent of jasmine hummed thick in the air, and the sounds of crickets and distant waves created a rhythm that seemed to sync with the pulse in his chest. As he walked along the winding paths, he found himself coming to the small chapel nestled at the edge of the gardens. It was a quiet, peaceful place, often overlooked by the other guests. The chapel had a certain stillness to it, a reverence in the air that David found oddly comforting. He had never been religious, but there was something about the simplicity of the chapel that spoke to him. It felt like a place where one could shed the weight of the world, even if only for a moment. He stepped inside and was greeted by the coolness of the stone floor, the low hum of the wind whispering through the open windows. The chapel was empty, the only sounds the faint rustle of the palm leaves outside. David walked toward the altar, his footsteps soft and deliberate on the worn stone. He knelt down, though he didn't know why. It wasn't prayer that brought him here. It was the need for answers, the need to find something he could hold on to, something that made sense in all the chaos.